So tell me, are you familiar with the Wizard of Earthsea or the Earthsea trilogy?
Yes, yes, I am. I've even found I was like we way back. I think somewhere in the early '90s. I even I and a friend of mine started a campaign using RuneQuest 3, I think, and some custom made rules to do Earthsea.
That
So we even
is
tried.
very enticing to hear
So
about.
I found my
Oh my God. Oh,
the
oh,
package we did.
oh
It was
wow.
in Dutch,
Yes.
mostly
Oh,
the text-wise.
fantastic. Oh, what a treasure.
And we had a map and, well, of course, handwritten notes. And I think it didn't go all that far because we had a little group of players and we played for, I think like something like 5 sessions or something, and then scheduling got in the way and people started to graduate or uh, do things on their. So we tried playing that, me and a friend of mine. Um, and back then we modified the magic system of RuneQuest 3, like it was a percentile system, and you could just learn all the different branches of magic.
Well, there were three in the core text. So
Mm-hmm.
this is the Avalon Hill version, right?
This is, I
So
think, the Avalon Hill
yes.
version. Yeah.
So that means that
So
they didn't
we
call it, they called it spirit magic.
yeah which
And
we
mhm.
mostly, I think we would just dumped all the stuff they put in and just made it a percentile, a skill system for magic instead.
The skill orientation for magic, either you came up with something completely on your own, or the sorcery rules were much more skill based, as I
Yeah, I think
recall.
it was sort of vaguely inspired by sorcery rules and by some other stuff we did.
Hmm.
Um, and it was really free form. Like you had to come up with, how do I do this and how many points is that, and then roll to see if it worked or not.
Right, right. There, as I recall, the again, I'm not saying you used it right out of the book, no, especially since
No,
you
but
have all
it was
those notes.
inspired
Right,
by more the sorcery system than
right,
rune magic or spirit magic.
right. The sorcery system in there is interesting because there's no parallel to it
Hmm.
in the earlier RuneQuest.
Yep. Yeah,
People, yeah.
it appeared at that point
Hmm.
in, I think, with RuneQuest 3. Quest 2 didn't have it, it just had spirit magic.
Yeah, they in the intervening period is when they started talking about the men of the West and coming
Yeah.
up with different ideas
Yeah.
for how that would work. And they also kept talking about lunar sorcery as if it were a thing. So I imagine
Hmm.
sooner or later somebody said, "Well, what on earth is that?"
Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do with well, they at least in those rules they treated it very much as engineering. Sorcery
Yeah.
was the sort of rationalist, uh, the very different from the
Yeah.
either
From
either spirit or rune magic in that it was
yeah.
very much a science.
Yeah,
Um,
rune magic was very much a divine thing. You had the gods, and the gods had a couple of runes usually,
right.
and spirit magic was, well, sort of ancestor spirits or minor spirits.
Minor spirits, but the magic itself was
Yeah.
powered out of your own body, whereas
Yeah.
the rune magic was granted to you through from a god through sacrifice.
Yes.
And then the sorcery was a in two things. One, it was a skill, and so the
Hmm.
idea was all education
Yeah.
and then your application of it. And then the idea was that there were forces that you were manipulating to create different effects, and they often involved energy, shapes, and the transfer of
Mm.
energy.
Yeah.
Tapping was the big thing, and there was a few other but again, it's customizable quality was the important part.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to hear more about that game that you
Hmm.
played, and talk a little bit about how the Earthseed trilogy caught you at that time and what you tried to make of it in play, or dreamed of.
Yeah. What um I think at that time we just had the 3 original books out, or at
Right.
least
That's
so
all I
we
care about at this point
yeah.
for purposes of talking about it.
And I've read them as a kid in Dutch first, and later on in English. So I was like, well, in my early teens, or
Hmm.
and I really liked the world and the idea behind it, and it was it was just a young adult adventure book.
Hmm.
So in that game, and a friend of mine also had read them, and she came up with the idea that we would run this game together. And we ran it as sort of a wizard school for. So all the characters were to be, at least have some affinity with magic, and go to the school, and
Right.
um, went on their first little trips, like uh, Sparrowhawk does in the first book, and gets to learn how to sail a little ship and
Right.
talk to the wind. And
There are some interesting features of that jump right out. First of all, in a game like that, one would
hmm
never, I think, sensibly imagine, well, will my character be a wizard or not? And if not, what else? Oh, they could be a sailor, they could be a farmer, they could be a this or that.
yeah,
And even though there are one or two characters, I think it's in the third book that we have a protagonist who's not a wizard, the young prince. But it is fairly sensible to say that this is a game, would be a game about being a wizard.
yeah. I think the
Um,
second book has the girl who uh,
right. The who's the sacrifice,
the
the
sacrifice,
ritual sacrifice woman,
priestess
and she's not a
sacrifice.
wizard, but
No,
she
affinity
has a
with.
certain kind of spiritual
Yeah.
presence and role at another level, which definitely puts her in a different category.
hmm
Um,
Yes, certainly.
the um, the thing with as I mentioned in the Patreon
hmm
pitch, it's hard to imagine a published setting that is more of an obvious game world. And I'm not saying it was built off role playing like so many were just a little later, but
No.
it's so much the kind of fantasy that led people to make maps
hmm
and complicated cultures and things like that in their
Yeah.
fantasy games. So it seems almost surreal that there is no Earthsea role playing game. I mean, it seems so obvious. I mean, the map is
hmm
already there. The
Yeah.
ethnicities are already there. The philosophies are already there. I mean, it's dying for it in so many ways. It's full of dragons,
Yeah. And
you
all
know.
different cultures and places, and
Yeah.
There we go.
All right. Hey,
yep.
Gordon.
I think I am good now.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
were
Now I can
just
hear you.
enthusing about the gamerness of the trilogy, the incredible gamer cheese that it offers at first glance anyway. I mean, if somebody were superficially to look at it.
hmm
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about the difficulties of turning it into more gamer focused stuff, and I think for everything you can identify that is really exactly what you'd expect for gamerness, there's something else that's not.
Yeah, we're right
So
now. We were just
hmm
listing the first,
yeah,
and I mean, and I'm sure you have the same list or could add to it a little bit. We talked about the geography, the scattered geography. We talked about the different
hmm
cultures. We talked about the different ethnicities. There's dragons everywhere. How clear it is that the young wizards going to school is just like gold for focus. There's no reason to play anything else particularly.
right,
And but that offers so much else to work with. You obviously we didn't talk about this, but you obviously get better, right? You learn this first, and then you
hmm
work on that, and then this next thing is really hard, and then it's whether you earn your staff or not, right?
right.
And I mean, all these things are so yeah. I mean, it's so doable. You could now, Herman, tell Gordon what you did.
Yeah, well, a long time ago, we did a campaign about Earthsea with notes in Dutch to be. We made a little me and a friend of mine, we made a little campaign based on RuneQuest 3 at the time, with the magic figures, sort of like a variant on the sorcery system in RuneQuest 3. So you had percentile-based skills to do the various things with magic. I think we had a skill for each of the categories, each of the 10 things we identified to.
That interests me. What were the 10 things?
Where's my notes and where's the? We chose it was a choice, of course, but we did weather, illusion, healing, binding, finding, mending, opening, revealing, changing, and summoning. And you can also learn names, I think. It was a separate thing where you could
Now
study
we're talking, right?
the true names of things, and that also was implemented as a percentile-based skill. So you rolled to know, do I know the name of this thing or this category?
Now we are talking, because this is where we're getting at the stuff where role-playing logic starts to become very, very tricky.
Yeah,
and you're doing in here. You're describing what we like to think of, I guess, as retroactive. We, the viewers, now realize that the character knew it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, they might not have known the name of the thing on the sheet, but they made the roll. So guess what? That was in their knowledge.
That was one of the
pack.
things you
Right.
learned at the
Right.
long winters
Right.
at the Namer.
Now the tricky thing, yeah, because they even talk about the master changer, the master namer, the master summoner. And the tricky thing about that is that it's not okay. Gordon, do you want to jump in here before I say anything about my next idea? But yes.
was thinking
Oh,
that
what is that?
Melanda.
Hold it up. Oh,
Yeah.
that's the one we talked about. Well, you found Melanda.
Yeah, well, I've had Melanda. We tried to play Melanda twice, a little bit.
Oh, that's right. You weren't in the
I've
fantasy talk. You weren't in the early fantasy
No,
talk. Oh.
I wasn't in there. But so the interesting thing, the only thing I'll add here for this is the interesting thing about Melanda is they've tied it to runes.
Right.
But they have a magic system that is driven by noun, verb, modifier, transition.
Right. Grammatical magic.
And so my understanding is that actually ended up influencing Ars Magica, although I don't know Ars Magica, so I can't really.
Well, I wish somebody
about that
could have brought that one, because I confess I am terribly confused by edition changes. I have a particular edition of Ars Magica, and I sat down and read it and said I will play this one day and all the rest of it. And ever since I try to get in a conversation with anybody about the game and we talk about how the magic works, they're obviously talking about something completely different.
A different edition than yours.
Well, then I ask, and it is a different edition, and I just hang my head and realize that someone's going to have to lead me through that whole culture of that game. So I
should be able to look it up. I think I have 4 editions of Ars Magica.
See. Now
but the only other interesting thing about Melanda is but that's only one magic system. They also have a magic system for summoning, magic system for medicine, a magic system that's driven by astrology and the stars. So they have a number of different approaches, which I think might be a good thing for Earthsea. I mean, it's not exactly clear that the Master Summoner is doing the same things as the wizards are when they're using their staffs. And, it seems like there may well be different things going on there.
Right. And that's sort of an interesting question, too. The one side of this, which both of your examples touch on, one side of this is the notion of study. And that this is not invocation. This is practice. You are a practitioner.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big issue in the way that it's presented in the books whenever they're talking about magic. I want to bring up kind of an interesting reversal of that,
Mm-hmm.
which is so much of the plot and the content is less about magic as a skilled practice and more about grasping its metaphysics, its significance. And over again, it's shown that somebody who is nimble, skilled, and quick at the practice is often not going to become a master, is not going to do things of significance. And that the main
Mm-hmm.
character is notable because his grasp and access at that level is actually more powerful at first than his skill, and only later is he shown to have buckled down and brought his skills up to that level. But he never loses sight, especially after his young experiences, he never loses sight that it is the meaning and the purpose of magic that matter more than your facility with it.
Yeah, I can remember in I think in the first book when he comes to his master Ogum the
Yeah.
Wise, I think,
The silent, yeah.
and Silent, that was it. And they walk through the rain, and he asks, "Why don't you let it stop?" "Well, because it's supposed to rain here." Of
Right,
course, he could let it stop here raining, but the wisdom of the master is to let it rain where it should rain,
right.
and to
And
know the consequences of the things he might do and thus chooses not to do.
the other aspect of that is that there's clearly a fragility to the world, to
Mm-hmm.
existence, that the use of the more powerful magic is disruptive to, or rather, it can either keep the world more whole, more itself, and more harmonious, basically, or it can disrupt it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when the main character, you know, irresponsibly starts using change and summon as a matter of youthful rivalry, the consequences are drastic. I mean, they're the whole first book, where
Yep.
your first big spell goes terribly wrong. That's a whole novel right there.
Yep.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, but it doesn't go terribly wrong because he miscasts it. Remember, he brought up the spirit of the
Yeah.
dead queen. He actually did it. That's not the problem, was failing your role. The problem was what were the consequences for himself. And so that's what interests me in these, because both of what you're talking about makes sense in terms of developing this as a skill,
Mm-hmm.
developing the actual manipulation of it. There are the different branches, which of course is more gamer, more different flavors of cheese,
Yeah.
to eat. And then there's also the very important distinction between illusion and change.
Yes.
And here is where I'm going to bring up something that I frequently bring up, which is this.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, now this is actually not in the labyrinth. This is not the dedicated role playing game that these rules would be ported into in a few years. This is just a battle map dueling game.
Yep.
But it has just enough evocative setting information and characterization in it that you cannot help but play it as a role playing game. At least I can't, and a lot of other people can't help
Mm-hmm.
it. And I'm certainly not the first one or the only one to have tried to take it and do something different with it from In the Labyrinth and later GURPS.
Yep.
Mhm.
The name of the game that I made on that basis is not very far from the original name. Right. So but the reason that I bring it up is that
Mm-hmm.
it has an extremely distinctive set of rules for what they call creation magic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there are all the things you can really create. There are walls, fires, darkness, but more importantly, creatures.
A wolf.
A wolf for at Intelligence 9, summon wolf. And there's wolf, but the wolves, bears, etc. Dragons.
Yep.
I should also point out that the dragon illustrations on the counters for that game are very Earthsea looking. That kind of slender, sinister, agile look that they have. And the anyway, so to the creation and the summoning, the way it works, you summon a creature and you have to power it to keep it there, to keep it in existence. Fires and stuff you don't have to keep powering, but you set them up. Whereas illusion, and there are only, there are illusions and images as well. Images are destroyed at a contact with reality. So if you like go into the darkness, or if you touch the fire, or if the image of the snake bites you, then then it disappears. But then there's illusions which operate exactly like the real thing. But if somebody suspects that you've cast an illusion, they can try to disbelieve it. And it's the closed roll. You don't know whether you've succeeded in your disbelief if you failed. Or, well, you'll know if you succeeded, but you don't know if you failed. But the illusion can do, unless it's disbelieved, the illusion can do anything and everything that the real thing can do. And it's a lot cheaper. You just pay strength one time. The real thing costs a lot to bring into existence and costs a lot to maintain. So, but it can't be disbelieved, of course. So it's a very interesting distinction. You've got real versus unreal. And then in unreal, you've got feels like, tastes like, sounds like, does, and affects reality, but isn't really there. And then finally you have the thing which just isn't there, and you only think it might affect reality, but it doesn't. Now, as a dueling game, it doesn't have anything about the long-term existence of these things. I'm thinking about in the novels, how many times, now that I have to admit that the wizards in the Earthsea trilogy have a tendency to drone on a little bit. And one of the things that they drill into the reader's head over and over is the difference between illusion and true creation or change. So in illusion, you can, as they frequently say, you can, patch the sails with illusion if you want to, but it won't make the ship sail any better. You can make yourself a meal and it will taste awesome and you'll go to sleep nice and full, but you'll wake up as hungry as if you hadn't eaten. And so on and so on and so on. You make yourself an illusion of a nice cool glass of wine. It won't get you drunk and it won't quench your thirst, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That wasn't really present in my mind, but that is a big deal in the books, is the difference between the illusion magic and real magic.
And the change, because they all learned illusion magic first.
Yeah.
Right. That was the first thing they learned. They're all showing off to each other all the time with it, And then I also want to point out that change and summons were very, very, very similar. So when you changed into a hawk and it was true change, or if you brought the spirit, a real thing, into existence, or summoned it back, I never quite got it sent straight in my mind whether you could literally summon a thing out of thin air or whether it had to be summoned from the past or something like that. It was, I'm not sure if it was ever really clear, but the point was that whatever it was real magic. You really do it. That is the thing. It is.
And you really change the world too.
And also, and what I'm getting at is that even though they divide them into different schools like that, like all those 10 things that you listed, there really seems to be a different hierarchy at work. There is illusion magic, and then there is real magic, and real magic depends on names. All of it depends on names. So therefore, naming is not a branch of magic. Naming is the transition into all the real magic, as far as I can tell. And so that leads us to the tricky question that Herman, you already described in
Hmm.
terms of how do you do I know the name of this in a game? So can you say again what it was?
Yeah, what we came up with was you had a skill in naming, and you rolled your skill to see if you knew the name of the thing or the class of thing you were trying to do magic or needed to know the name of for some reason. Um, and the more specific it was, the harder it got.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that you also kept a list of things you knew the name of, because
Right. Once we knew you
once
knew
you
it,
know
then you had it. Yeah.
we all know that you know the name of a cow.
Right.
Uh, you can just use that for any other cow you meet, except if you want
Mhm.
to know that specific cow,
Now,
who
what
might
was
also
kind of
have a.
right, and it's also a little interesting because in the book, you
Hmm.
have like when you studied under the master namer, you learned a lot of the true names. So the idea was that there was an enormous catalog of known true names that all you really have to do is study. And I think the implication, or at least, and I think it's even stated explicitly at least once, is that if you know the true name of like a particular flower, then you can use it in other magic. Like you can change something into that flower
Hmm.
or
Yeah,
something like that because you know the name. And so
and
you
you can
change the
change.
name
Yeah,
of this to the name of that, and that is reality. You have changed the universe
yeah,
when you do that.
that's
And
what I
so
remember.
the and so therefore, that's why the 10 different types of magic, as indicated by the academic study on Rolk, don't
Hmm.
really seem to be the actual magic system, which is implied through the plot and the other philosophical points. And so that's one thing that really struck me. I mean, I read those novels at the same time you guys did. We were all, for me it was 7th grade, 7th and 8th grade, and I would have been 13 and 14 years old. And in retrospect, it really wasn't very long after they were published, to my surprise. When you read it and it
Hmm.
feels like it's such an evocative, so powerfully written piece that they feel like they've been around for centuries. They
Mm.
feel like you're reading something, that was written long ago. And
Or at least as old as Tolkien.
right, right. It doesn't use the same language. In retrospect, it
No.
is written in a much more 70s kind of voice, but
Hmm.
Mm.
but its evocative power is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so so then you read it and you're like, wait a minute, I read this like right after it was published, how can that be? So anyway though, and it was right at that year that I bought this. I bought this in 8th grade.
Mm.
And I was reading it, and it was just, I didn't even question it. It just seemed so obvious to me that Jackson had read, the Earthsea trilogy and was
Hmm.
working on that in terms of this hierarchy of image to illusion to real. And I was very taken with it. And I said, I can play Earthsea with this. And I had D&D in its various versions that were confusing me at the time, and I had some of the other games, like early, and it was clear Tunnels and Trolls and D&D were not what we were talking about, not even a
Hmm.
little. And it was also clear, though, what I found was I said, okay, I can use this to play Earthsea. And then I realized that the whole idea of powering it out of your own body and that being the constraint really didn't apply. It was clear that injury hurt your ability to do magic.
Hmm.
When Ged takes a spear through him, and I think it's in the third book, he's magically helpless for a long time or highly limited for a long time. Um, but I think the idea being it's not that magic requires your own bodily power. It's just that you yourself have to be in a healthy psychological state
Mm.
or something. But at least being injured meant that your magic was not going to work very well. But I couldn't get it to go further past that in my mind. I say, well, how does he do this? And well, he spends more bodily energy. No, that doesn't seem to work. That's not involved here. This has to do more with knowing the name. And it really, I understand what you're saying about the about rolling to know. rolling to
Yeah,
have known. And it's a
it
very
was.
good attempt. The question is, let's take it to the dramatic scene in that first book
Hmm.
when he sails the Dragon's Run. Wait, no, he's said to have sailed the Dragon's Run already. Now he's gone out to this funky little island where there's this heinous dragon who is plaguing, whose offspring plague the archipelago.
Yeah.
So, anybody remember the scene?
Generally, I'm
Uh,
not focusing exactly.
I think
Um,
he first binds some of the small dragons,
Right, he
the
kills them
ones who are
actually.
still
Yeah, drops them in
kills
the
them,
sea and stuff
drops
like
them in the
that. Yeah.
sea, binds their wings
Right.
because
Right.
they are still speechless, I think.
Correct. Yeah.
And then he comes to the big one, the great dragon of Orm, doing
Mhm.
it out of memory, and then he binds him with his name,
Right.
Yvonne, or something like
Exactly.
that.
Yeah. The dragon's like, "What have you got?" And he's
Yeah,
like,
I got your
I've got
name.
your name."
Yeah.
And it even is clear that Ged himself does not know that this is going to work when he does it. It's all scholarship. He's based it on putting jigsaw pieces together from
Hmm.
history that apparently no other wizard has done. So that's another thing that's worth thinking about. It's not obvious, right? Knowing a
And
name of
it's
something
yeah,
that's personal name of something is not something you just go and like think about for a few days and go, oh, well, its name is this, right? And so
no.
he goes out there and it's a risk. He says the name, and for all he knows, the dragon's going to go, "Boah, ha ha, that was some other dragon,"
Hmm.
But no, it is this dragon. So the question is this a role? Is this something that a player could enjoy doing? I mean, by all of the logic you used, and I see no reason to
Hmm.
use any other logic, it would be a really fucking hard roll.
Yeah, maybe you could do research library, find libraries, find old sources, find whatever to see if you can, and then still it would be a hard roll, and you still wouldn't know. Do I know the name of? Do I name of that other dragon?
I found a name,
A
right?
dragon, and it
Right.
seems to be the right one, but is
Mhm.
it this? It's still a gamble. It would still be a gamble in a game as well, I think.
Well, that's the interesting question, though. Is it as dramatic in the, how am I going to put it?
Hmm.
Does that really serve our purpose of wanting to play in Earthsea? And
Yeah.
do we really, you see, that's where the tricky thing comes in. Is the probabilistic approach to such things at all
Hmm.
satisfying in terms of enjoying this setting for what it has to offer?
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about simulating the setting. I'm talking about enjoying what it has to offer philosophically and in terms of its drama. In many ways, this event too is not a climactic event. It's not a throwaway because the very significant acts that gives him his fame. This is
Hmm.
what really puts Ged on the map. But it isn't what the plot of the story is about. It's not effectively an adventure being played or experienced. It is the account of something awesome that he does and is known to have done very
Hmm.
quickly.
Yeah.
So it's very different from the conflicts that he faces against his own shadow, where those are the ones where the risk is really deeply felt. Those are the ones where the things at stake and the emotions of the conflicts are so powerful. The the confrontation with Yavald is spectacle, and we never see Yavald again, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. There's another dragon that helps him in the
Yeah.
third book, but
The eldest or something. Yeah.
it's not Yavald, and it's not really like a relevant event. It's showing us something that he did that's very impressive in setting terms,
Hmm.
but in story enjoyable terms, audience and author terms, it's a little bit more of a gimme, isn't it?
Yeah, it's setting him up for whatever comes next and giving him a sort of position and role. And
Right.
fame, I think.
Well, I think the important thing is to show that when it comes to being a badass wizard in terms of the archipelago, this little
Hmm.
goat herder from Gaunt, who's been nothing but a pain in the ass to everybody, student and otherwise, the entire time, has finally kind of, buckled down. He's had his bad experience. He's scarred. This is
Yep.
back when he has his familiar, he
Hmm.
has his staff, and he's been a badass enough that he's already met dragons. We don't see him do that, but he's sailed the dragon run is frequently
Hmm.
mentioned in reference to him, and he does all these things, and now we get to see him basically put his big rubber stamp. Yeah, I am a wizard of note. And why do we do this? Because his shadow is still unbalanced. That
Mhm.
he could go on and on and on to become a more and more and more powerful world spanning wizard if he wanted to, and
Hmm.
he's still fucked up.
Yeah. So you made vague allusions to a different game that you're kind of aware of that has the name similar to Wizard. And one of the thoughts I've had for some years now would be kind of the metaphor in Sorcerer is a dysfunctional relationship. If
Hmm.
we're going to use Sorcerer for Earthsea, it's a dysfunctional relationship with yourself.
It certainly is, or somebody's dysfunctional relationship with themselves. The
Yeah,
first and the third books, obviously, the most
yeah,
obviously. In the first one, it's Ged and his own shadow side, very, very Jungian. And
Hmm.
yeah,
then you have, in the third one, you have the wizard who makes himself immortal and thus punches a hole in reality throughout which all the magic and all the harmony is draining.
Yep.
And so yeah, in many ways, the humanity mechanic would be grossly
Hmm.
impactful. I
yeah.
mean, lowered humanity is a serious risk. You bring yourself to zero humanity. You don't just bring yourself to zero humanity. You have harmed everybody if you do that. And especially if you do so with the kind of magic that we're talking about. So it's to me really compelling to say, what if we take the academics of it all and the schools and branches
Hmm.
and all of that and let it just be window dressing?
It's mostly color if
Right.
you
In the
look
story,
at
it's
the
mostly
story.
window
Yeah.
dressing. I mean, it's not like, oh no, I don't have, I'm less good at summoning than I am at changing. That doesn't
No.
really seem to ever matter. What seems to matter is not only your ability to name,
Hmm.
and there seems to be a certain weight to using the name. They have to say it with this kind of authority. They have to, they have to know what you never see like a name being used and it not working, but there's something about the way that it's being presented. You can't just it's not like somebody could just repeat the syllables of the true
Yeah, I was
name,
gonna.
right? You have
Yeah,
to
I
mean
was
it.
gonna. I was gonna say that's one of the things that. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read the books. I probably ought to reread soon. But I have this vague sense that it's not just that you've gone to the master namer and memorized the list of names. You need to remember the right name,
Hmm.
He
and
talks about it
you need
too.
to concentrate on it in the right way. It's not, and
Yeah.
so that's kind of one of the ways in which it's kind of contra gamer, is that it's not just it's on my sheet, I know that.
Hmm.
You have to actually deliver it right, and of course
There's actually
in the
some
context of
verbiage about that. The master
yeah,
namer actually has a
yeah,
little bit of a monologue about that in the books. And they're so freaking short that,
yeah,
we're talking about that wonderful style of writing that I miss with every fiber of my being, where,
Hmm.
you remember a speech or an event and you think of it as this phenomenally significant event in your own history of literature. And you go back and you realize that it's like, a page and a half of a
yeah,
Hmm.
pocket-sized paperback.
yep,
you know
yep,
and this is one of those when the master namer says you don't he even what you said totally reminds me. I finally realized this. he says you have to know the plant. He's talking about a plant. You don't just
Yeah.
memorize the name. You have to know the plant. You have to smell it. You have to touch it. You have to work with all the things it's good for. You have to know its names in ordinary language. You have
Yes.
to know its history. You have to know where it grows. You have to really
Mhm.
experience the reality of this plant in a way that can only be described as Zen.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very powerful in that sense, and it's not metaphysical. You don't get to know the spirit of the plant. You don't get to know the legends of the plant. It's concrete as hell.
And in the context of the books, it lends great dramatic weight, and whether Jed or whoever succeeds or fails at doing that is meaningful. And
Right.
I think that would be the kind of thing you'd want to bring into the game. Make sure that those moments have the right meaning in the game.
I'm not just the
Of
person who knows your name or its name. I'm the person who gets it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right.
and whatever the dramatic situation is, figuring out that you know it's not just he uses the spell to make the tree branch go through somebody. It's like he had to feel the branch going into the person.
Right.
Whatever the appropriate thing is, it's not just casting a spell. It's investing
In this reality in some way.
in this
Yeah.
reality.
And
Exactly.
there's also the interesting notion of names as something you can bestow. And one of the most important, remember the whole point of the protagonist in the first one, and actually she fits better into the pattern I was talking about now than I
Mhm.
thought a few minutes ago. When she's a little girl, her name is taken from her,
Yeah.
and she's forever after referred to as the Eaten One. And whenever she asks the eunuch who's tending to her, who was I, who was my family, whatever, he pats her on the head and said, it was all eaten. And so but when our protagonist, whose name I keep never saying much, because I use a hard G, and Gordon just used the soft G, and
Yeah.
we'll have to have fandom wars now, I suppose, you know. And so, but anyway,
It's long enough that my choice was random.
I
So
know, I know, but
we can always say Sparrowhawk.
that's
Yeah.
true. That's
Yeah.
true. So what he does is he gives her a name. And I'm trying to remember, and I should know because there have been times when these books have been as clear to me line by line as anything I've ever written, or sorry, anything I've read.
Mhm.
But I can't recall off the moment whether he makes up a new name for her or whether he recovers her old one. And he does it either way. He does it by knowing her so well,
Mhm.
by feeling her so well. And I think, as implied in the book more than anything, believing in her as a person, somebody who does have a name, who cares whether the old one was eaten, who cares whether you don't know your name, or where everyone says now you have no name. You're real, and I believe in you.
Mhm.
And I say you are real. This is your name. And again, I'm not sure whether he's recovering the old one or making up a new one, but either way,
That comes from
it's
her.
that essence of that act which makes her believe, that lets her know that she is a human, she is a person, she is not somebody who is defined by these people who have power over her. And he relies on her
Mhm.
to get her out. That's another one. Now that I think about it, that's another one where he spends a fair amount of the book in magically weakened because he has been physically abused.
Yep.
He's been wounded
Yep.
badly and he's dying of thirst, and he's quite feeble through most of the book. And I now that I'm remembering, it's that act which is his first act. Until then, he's able to cast like minor light spells and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
But it's then when he names her that the whole story changes, and she is now herself and is able
Yeah, I
to act
think
on her own hook and get them out of there. Yeah.
yeah, if I remember right, she names him or he names her, and she gives him water.
Right. Right. Well, I thought maybe she gave him water before that, but I could be wrong. But,
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
But anyway, I think there was some physical improvement there as well.
Right. Right. So, but that's sort of the interesting thing that comes to mind too, that it's not like the Avowed where he studied and put two and two together in some kind of like scholarly detective work. This was a very visceral act of much more metaphysical recognition. And so talking about this in role-playing terms is very weird. The probabilistic approach seems a little off, although you can kind of get there. I mean, you could play the way you were talking about, and it's certainly not the first time that retroactive knowledge of something can be fun. You know, that's definitely a viable play approach.
And remember, this is what was this? Somewhere early 90s or something. So
as an
we had
attempt, I mean, I would
as an attempt, it
venture to
was
say that even
yeah.
today, if you gave the task
Oh
to
yeah.
99.9% of big name game designers out here, they'd probably do exactly what you described. I
Yeah.
mean, I wouldn't say otherwise. I'm trying to get at some of the weird notions as to why any number of people, us included, maybe look at that and go, yeah, that could work. And then they kind of go, yeah, but something's not quite right. Just like when I was looking at Wizard, which wasn't probabilistic, but it had a mechanic, a resource-based mechanic. And I said, the resource isn't working for this. And it's kind of related because of the injury thing, but it's not the way they have it. So the two ways that resolution is framed in role-playing are those two things: probability, resource. And they're not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, or at least they're not going to be sufficient.
Right, right. One can definitely have the scholarship play into it because that is such a big part of the series too. And as I said, you know, that the health and injury issue seems, I mean, something's in there, right? Something important is in there.
And there's also the minor magics which are used by the witch in the beginning and the shipwright, and many people seem to have a little bit of magic.
Right.
Have a little bit of, so it's something which is common, but that's and the weather has someone who comes by to make the weather right for harvesting or whatever.
Right.
You get the impression that there's a lot of small magic going on as well as
and so I mean, but it's real. I mean, they do make the rain come. It's not illusion. And yet one doesn't get the idea that they're roaming around like changing the name of reality when they do it. They seem to be shifting.
Weather seems to be something else than reality.
Right. And so
and there's corner cases of powerful versions of that, right? You know, suppressing the earthquake.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, the something about what's going on with
that's right. OG in the Silent is famous because he suppressed the earthquake. That's right.
Yeah. It's not like famous for being powerful in all areas of magic, but he suppressed the earthquake.
Yep.
Well, that's the other interesting question. What makes somebody a badass? And it's very clear that the only real badasses are also philosophers. You don't, even the villain in the end, in the third book, is notable for what a deep thinker he was. No one else could have found, immortality. And so, but the idea being that, that the hedge wizard, the minor weather worker, in the third book, there's the dyer, the woman who does the famous dyes of that area.
The shipwright who does some runes, so ship can.
And so they're all famous for their sort of manipulation of reality, but it's pretty clear that they're not really philosophers. They're sort of there's the implication that they are artisans who love the aesthetics of it, that you can't
Hmm.
do it without loving it. You can't
Yeah.
do it without really feeling and knowing and liking it. It's more than just, nimble fingers or something. But they don't have that kind of philosophical depth that it takes to be, the heavy hitters that we're talking about.
Hmm. Yep.
So that's the interesting thing, that we're talking about a philosophical shift rather than a merely, skill based, or I have a lot of resources. I've got a
Hmm.
big bank, so I can be a big wizard. I've got a high probability of success, so I can be a big wizard. That's not really the logic at work at all. And that sort of, that's where I ran aground trying to think about it in these terms. And that's why I went, instead of looking at the creation spells, I went to the summoning spells. And you can see that the summoning
Hmm.
spells or the summoning in sorcerer has its roots in the summoning of wizard. But so that was my solution. I said, I can't do that. I can't do that naming thing. And then we go to two near contemporaries. One of which would be the campaign supplement for champions, Mystic Masters.
Hmm.
And here is where I ran aground very quickly, because okay, you can take the various GURP source books about magic. You can take any number of other books of that time, late 80s and early 90s, which says, okay, let's talk about different magic systems. And then you can take Nephilim, which takes one of those and jacks it up to, if there's a number past 11, that's where it goes.
Hmm.
But all of them are thinking in terms of that more academic approach of, okay, this is the culture, this is the rhetoric, this is the sort of, justification. So what they give you in what they give you in the game terms is, they talk about, the sort of the what does transdimensional mean in champions? What does a trigger effect mean? Gestures and incantations, um, we're going to shift the rules from champions, where an ego attack does no real damage, just stun damage. Well, now we're going to say it does ego damage. But do you see that they're kind of just sort of adjusting the superpowers of magic,
Hmm.
um, more than anything else? And although they have got quite a lot, like different rules approaches toward what does going desolid mean, um, then there's sources of magic, personal magic out of your own energy, with cost endurance, external magic, which draws on external forces of some kind. Um, and so, sort of, there's mana out there, kind of like oil. If I get me
Hmm.
some mana, then I can burn the mana. Bestowed magic, where you make a deal and get to do something. Focus magic, where there's some kind of way, a repository. It's a little bit like the mana thing, but there's these, instead of an aura, it's,
Hmm.
concentrated in a made item or grown item. And so, but that's where it stops. Again, it's all effectively about where the resource comes from and what skills are necessary to pull it all together. And the same thing, in many ways, can be found with a slightly different emphasis in the next thing I brought, which is the Fudge Book of Magic, Medley of Magics. And the idea was that it would show you several, and then you would get to follow the logic to do the same with any other
Hmm.
kind of magic you can think of. And one of the difficult things about it is Fudge does one thing. It rolls for things.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, Fudge isn't anything but just rolling to see your level of success.
Yeah.
Are we really talking about levels of success, you know, in this? There are times when
Well,
he tries to cast a spell, or someone tries to cast a spell or say a word or whatever, and it doesn't work.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, Gordon, what were you going to say?
well, I was just going to say that, yeah, that the key to making Earthsea work would be to have whatever you're doing in the magic system be as impactful for, something meaningful to the caster, something internal, something that has nothing to do with an outward success or an obvious execution issue. Otherwise, I mean, it, it's not the reason for doing magic is as important as all of that within the context of the books.
And that's
And
definitely explicit. I'm thinking of the
yeah,
when all of the school wizards, the student wizards, are showing off to one another,
Hmm.
and the Sparrowhawk changes himself into a Sparrowhawk,
right.
and Jasper, who most people today would probably recognize as Draco in Harry Potter. When Jasper, mocks him and says, and actually he's just actually a little bit taken aback, and he sort of says illusion, and even he doesn't sound so sure about it. And his friend speaks up and says, no, that's true change, and that's enough.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Don't freaking, everybody's shocked, because to do that means, just like you were talking about,
Yeah.
wow, he really means it. And if he means that, this dude could mean anything. I mean,
Hmm.
if he can mean things like that, then we better watch out. That's
right.
some really really nasty shit to just
Yeah.
be walking around doing. And so, but how is that done in? You see, this is I'm going to be like geek heretic here, but Arthur C. Clarke is full of shit. That there isn't that technology, sufficiently advanced technology, is indistinguishable from magic, is the kind of thing that some ignorant yahoo who never read any fantasy or myth in his life would say.
Mm.
And the notion, I speak as a very unmetaphysical person. I'm talking about literature and legend and myth. I'm not talking about the way things are. And so but the notion being that, no, clearly the magic in Earthsea is not a sufficiently advanced technology, even though the steps to getting there involve what look like academic and intellectual analysis, or at least in part, that's
Hmm.
involved. And doesn't OG on the Silence say in the beginning that there are many paths, that his path is the path of silence and contemplation and nature, and basically taking long walks in the woods?
Yeah. Something like that.
And sooner or later, Sparrowhawk can't take it anymore.
Yeah,
And
Because he's a kid and
right, and
wants
he, well, yeah, and
to
he
know it
says
now.
that's, and Ogian says, I can't teach you. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I don't. He's actually really nice about it. I like this in the book. He
Mm.
said it's not like I don't love you, but this is not the place for you. If you're going to go way off the rails and do something insanely heinous, you know, because the way I teach allows you to go badly wrong, and you're just too freaking powerful. You are just we never it's never given. It's not like so many books where he's like the chosen one, thank God. And it's not like he has some inborn mana repository. He's just like bursting with the magic energies more than everybody else. That's not in there either. Again, thank
Yeah.
God. Instead, it's his will. It's simply his will. He is so gifted is not the right word. He is gifted or
Driven.
cursed with a sense of
Driven,
self.
maybe.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, what's that? Driven? Yeah.
Driven.
Yeah. He's gifted or cursed with a sense of self that is potentially villainous. Potentially, it may be inadvertently villainous, but potentially villainous. Ogian realizes, wow, this guy could
Mm.
be a disaster. And in fact, it's that very same kind of approach which leads to the villain in the third book. And so, So he says, what are you going to do? You have to choose. You can walk with me here in the woods and realize,
Hmm.
that you can't do that shit, man. you know, or you can go to Rolk and it's not my way to teach,
Yep.
and you'll have to study. It's going to suck, basically. And it's the last line of the chapter says, "Master, I will go to Rolk." And so and he doesn't fit in there at all, right? He has a terrible
Mm.
time as a student. And so I mean, eventually, after a bad experience, he learns to love the learning. But that's another point. Again, the academics, the schools, the categories, the routines of the sort of mundane skills that you build are only one path, and not everybody can do it. They can study their asses off, and if they don't get it, right? If they don't
Yeah.
get it, they won't earn their staff.
And my memory is that some of them might earn their cloak, I think, or something,
Right, right.
and
Jasper
then
earns
go
his
off
cloak, but
to
he doesn't earn his staff.
something like that. And
Right.
some of
And you can go
them,
off and like Jasper goes off and becomes a court
yeah,
wizard somewhere, you
yeah, you
know.
can become a court wizard, can
Right.
get a pretty good living out of doing magic and being a court mage and stuff. But you won't be follow the
Right.
path to being a wise
Right. You're not going
real
to be
mage,
an archmage, you're not
an
going to be a
archmage or something
master.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so but again, that transition has very little to do with whether you failed your flower test, your botany
Mm.
exam. And it has a lot more to do. Although in Rolk you get the idea that they kind of couch it that way.
Yeah.
And though ultimately though that's not what happens. I mean, that's not where you get that degree. And even like the friend Eshkariol, that's his true
Mm-hmm.
name. I can't remember
Mm-hmm.
his casual name, but he earns his staff, but he doesn't go further. He doesn't.
No.
He actually has a great deal of empathic wisdom though, that he always had,
Mm-hmm.
and he brings that to a higher art later in the story. And so we see that what makes the guy, I think, what makes it clear to us that it makes sense that he would earn his staff and Jasper wouldn't, is that he is a values based person. He really
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
understands that level of interaction. And so this is really now we're in like total, terra incognita when it comes to role playing, aren't we? In terms of game design,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, this is really brutal. How are you going to on the face of it, on paper, the conflict in that third book is just so familiar. Oh, somebody cast a bad spell and now all the magic is draining out of the world. The magic's going away. We must stop it and make sure the magic comes back. It sounds like something so out of any epic
Mm-hmm.
fantasy game supplement series of supplements that you go through, right? I mean, it just seems, but that's not what it is in the book at all.
No.
I mean, even though, yes, on paper, that's pretty much exactly the problem, right? Somebody went too far, cast the wrong spell,
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately, he was good enough to make it work, and now we're
And
all fucked, right?
now we need to go fix the world.
Now we got to go fix the world. But how does that take you to the line, only too far is far enough?
Mm.
The core line of the story. How does that take you to Aaron, the prince, from the metaphysical fields of pain, bringing the rock of pain home with him and keeping it safe? How does it translate to the, I mean, in some ways, there's the opiate addiction, Hazia, right? There's the drug addiction in the beginning and the horror of slavery with the guy with the amputated tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, the book is being a little bit manipulative there because Hazia obviously existed before this guy came and punched a hole in the world. Slavery existed
Yeah.
before, and its horrors existed before that happened. but those things are used in some way that you get the idea that somehow they're more normalized after this has happened.
Yeah, but becoming more widespread and
Yeah, it does. It's a
seems,
little
or
odd. It's kind of
yeah.
there's sort of two things going on. One is that Aaron is being taken out of his comfort zone and his privilege, to see the world at a
Hmm.
much more shocking level that Sparrowhawk had always known. Sparrowhawk
Yeah.
grew up hard, right? I mean, he even when he was just a young wizard, he went and he pulled the oars with, the other oarsmen, and he lived pretty rough. You get the idea that
Hmm.
he always was, he even says at one point he's more comfortable,
Yeah.
camping or, sleeping in his boat than he is, in a palace somewhere. And so but Aaron comes from privilege in every possible way and is completely, thrown
Hmm.
by these experiences. And so, but there is also the impression that somehow the horror of these experiences is augmented, or it's never said that it's more common, but
You
something
get the
about this
impression
is
that,
now more real or more irrecoverable, perhaps. It's never going to get better. That's kind of the implication in the third book, that nothing's going to get better. The magic has gone out of the dyes. The singer, the mad singer that
mm,
they meet, right? The guy who was a skilled magician of song is now, completely shattered uh
yeah, you
and
get the
yeah,
impression that those things which make the world special also get drained out and
right, right.
seep out of the world, making it a bleaker place. And
That's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people aren't very charmed by that book. Halfway through it, you're like, man, I'm fucking depressed.
mm,
You are
Mm.
too. I mean, it is just by the time Ged gets wounded and is bleeding out, you're like, fuck, man, I am just really bummed. And so, that's really what you're fighting for, and that's why it's so important that they don't do it by like being more beautiful. They don't do it by being more noble.
mm,
They both get weathered. They both get injured. They both get they both in despair at one point or another. They go
yeah,
through the field. Then when they go into the field of pain, they don't come back by getting back out. That's the whole point. They got to go
mm,
all the way through.
yeah,
You got to feel all of it. You want to come in here and you want to gain from this, you're going all the way through. And how this is where I look at the medium of role playing and I say, how is it literature if it can't do that? And again, I don't mean simulate that precise
mm.
story. I mean tap into that level of storytelling, story creation in which such things happen.
Well, and I wouldn't say that they're common, but I think that kind of thing happens in gameplay, almost by accident on occasion.
Mm.
Our RuneQuest
The
game
the
had its
real
moments. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
and so the real question is what can you do to try and nurse that and encourage it a little bit further and provide a more hospitable environment and that kind of thing, because I think we can say that maybe if you go into a game where you're doing Earthsea with a good heart and a dedication to the material, maybe you'll get some of that out of it, but I'd like to do more than maybe.
Right,
Mm.
and again, our RuneQuest game points the way because there were elements of it that were more than just, oh my god, that was significant,
Yeah,
sort of thing. There were things we were all doing that kind of pressed that way.
yeah,
But still, it would be nice to have a somewhat more tangible notion, and it isn't going to be a table you can roll on.
No.
Not
yeah,
by itself, it won't.
yeah.
But maybe the right kind of table is the right kind of foundation for what we're
Hmm.
talking about. Herman, from last week's seminar, we talked a lot about hard mechanics, softer mechanics, and then emotional investments, which might as well
Mm.
be mechanics if they get going, if and when they
Right.
get going. And Gordon, I just put that up today. I don't know if you noticed that
Yeah,
I
no,
did, but
I haven't
yeah.
seen that yet.
But it's but
Um,
we did the system diagrams and we really finally after all these years, finally got to the reason why I draw the fucking things in the first place. And so it's not just to draw that diagram, you know.
Mm.
And so so this is kind of, I mean, if it has to be an effect of that kind, are we really talking about something so deep as to make everybody literally want to invest in an experiential course in some branch of Zen? You
Well, I
know,
think that
that's
that may be one of the that may be
sheesh.
one of the tricky things. That may be one of the tricky things in Earthsea, right? Is that um, it's immediately understandable and accessible as a coming of age story,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
but it's a coming of age story from a balance Buddhist Zen Tao oriented perspective than rather than anything else that we're used to from that kind of a story. So what does that mean? You need to change in order to make it work when you try and make something like that again. I'm
Perhaps
not
I would.
sure.
What makes the Earthsea trilogy work as literature? And you pointed out that the basic story element is there, coming of age, and it's not just the first book. In the first one, it's about Sparrowhawk's coming of age, and we see the distinction between professional expertise and personal growth,
Mm-hmm.
and how the professional expertise can make him the guy who can take down Yavowed, and he's better at it than anyone else. But personal growth is what allows him to name his own shadow, to realize that his shadow has his name. Sorry about spoiling the book there, everybody. Read it yourself. Y'all should have done that anyway, you know, period. You know, what's the use of reading the Wheel of Time? Do I really need footnotes for that comment? All right. So, you know, in role playing, what is the nature of the medium and the nature of the available systems, of which we have many?
Mm-hmm.
And among the three of us, we represent, I think, a pretty broad swath of knowledge about the way these things have been done and experience. The question is, we don't. I haven't really thought of one. I'd love to. I mean, do you have? Let's go to the Ars Magica question, because the
Mm-hmm.
what comes to mind with that in regard to these things?
Yeah, unfortunately, from my perspective, Ars Magica, the thing that comes to mind is they say it's got a flexible magic system, and so therefore maybe it's a good fit. Um, Actually, I might even know a little bit more. The other one that came to mind as a possible one that I have the smidgenest amount of experience with is Mage. You
Well,
know,
the
because
Book of
that is
Madness in Mage
that is a
works.
manipulation of reality kind of
Right.
thing.
The basis with Mage is, at least from the core book, is consensus reality.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that actually would be a problem for Earthsea. Yeah, it would.
right. And so, I mean, Earthsea's very much more, I don't know if it's platonic or not, but it leans in the direction of saying it's a little too concrete to be platonic, right? It's not an ideal
Mm-hmm.
of the hawk, it's its actual concreteness, you know? So it's a little bit more, I'm going to get in trouble by saying this, but it's actually a little more Nietzschean, that the metaphysical power of something is that it exists, not that you
Mm-hmm.
idealize it. But but anyway, I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm
So
just crazy, but does Schopenhauer make more sense every single year that I get older? I mean, is that what's going on here? You know, he called it the will, but he didn't mean will like intent. He meant
Mm-hmm.
the inescapable drive of reality and its properties. And if you don't like it, who cares? You know, it doesn't. Here you are. If you're going to be playing anybody but the archmages, you're not going to get to play them. Let's say we're going to do that. You can earn your cloak,
Mm-hmm.
you can earn your staff, and
And
basically Eshkariel is your player character. You can play Eshkariel. You can't play you. Well, still that empathic. There seems to be that there would have to be some kind of system in which soft or hard or imply or emergent, by which your decency your commitment to the world as it is, right? It's, hey man, it's raining here because it's supposed to be raining here. I'm not
almost
messing with that.
almost
I'll
tempted to
suppress the
use.
earthquake to
Yeah.
save lives, but I
Hmm.
did a thing when I did that. And I had to make the choice that I cared about those lives. And that ultimately, in the fullest scheme of things, I'm not really going to be able to hold up my head and say it was right, except on a basis of the fact that I'm a human.
Which sort of points like to some sort of humanity
Yes,
kind of
humility is
thing.
huge. That's what Eshkariel has, and that's what all of the other ones. In fact, isn't it kind of frustrating to the students
Hmm.
that their grand master of this and master of that all seem to be these kind of quiet, dudes, these kind of quiet, contemplative guys. And they ask a question, Master, how do we do this? And he's like, wouldn't it be better if you didn't? That's not what I was asking. So
I'm struck by a memory of talking to people who ran an Earthsea game, and I don't even remember what system they used, but it was nothing special. But the what they did, it was set in Great Havnor, and it was all about the
right,
court mages and
right.
all that
That's you could do that.
all that stuff that you're just talking about, totally irrelevant.
Right.
These are
Yeah.
these are the people who the rain cloud bounces between each
That's
wizard as
right.
they're trying
Yes.
Yeah.
That's where the different
to
weather
avoid getting
mages
hit.
are reaching. Nope, can't rain here. Nope, can't rain there. And the poor fucking rain
No,
cloud's like,
we have a party. You can't train here.
You could
Yeah.
do a game set in Earthsea there, no problem.
Mhm.
And you know what? That wouldn't be that bad. That would be really interesting because the duels of wizards and the politics at that level would be no small thing. And you get the idea from the tossed off comments.
Mhm.
And that's the other thing about the literature. This particular body of literature is so rich in what is implied by a casual conversation. You just get this enormous, picture of everything you just said. We know Jasper's off there kicking up a ruckus in that regard. We know he's
Yeah.
sleeping with the queen, and we know that he's fooling the king with an illusion of the queen. Right? It's so there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and there's a huge history and backstory to Earthsea that comes across without a Silmarillion.
Right,
And
right. I mean, the history of the dragon. There's the history of the dragon who comes to help him in the third book. There's
the Ring of
clearly
Erethek.
Yeah, the ring of
there's the
Yeah.
Karg culture, right? The white
Yeah.
barbarians who come and raid.
Yeah.
And then there's and then
the
also the history of that Earth cult. And it seems to me
Yeah.
as
Mhm.
though Sparrowhawk is actually a little bit aggrieved at what it has become. He never quite comes out and villainizes them as a bunch of evil occult witches who are, and they don't punch a hole in reality, do they?
They
Right?
sort
They're
of
not like the guy in the third book.
yeah.
And so, and he seems almost very sorrowful about the way that their whole, practice has gone rather than, okay, we got to stamp this shit out. These are an
Mhm.
abomination. He totally doesn't.
No.
So it's, a matter, I think, of some. Actually, I'm trying to think. Does he or do the caverns collapse at the end? I'm thinking they don't. Of the second book, I'll have to double
I think
check
they
that one.
might do, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Certainly,
Or something.
the nameless ones aren't gone.
Right.
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 At the end of
Right.
it, they don't disappear.
Right. He doesn't like solve that metaphysically, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
No. Been a
I
while
think
since
I
I read it.
remember in my reread a decade or more back, noticing more about how that actually impacted Kargish culture, and that there was
Right.
actually a significance to the Kargs in what happens
I think you're right.
with him there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the earlier bits of the story, there are no white people who are mages or
No,
who
no, there
come
are.
to.
You're right. Right. And they only show up as the Kargs who come and raid
Yeah.
raid the Gaunt, the island of Gaunt. you're right. There's definitely a cultural thing going on that the religions tie into and the different magical practices tie into. Clearly, the magic of negation or the role of negating magic as a form of power is part of that cult. I mean,
Yeah.
even without being thirsty and injured, I mean, he says, "Yeah, I'm having a tough time in these catacombs. Right? This is a terrible place, and nothing here has a name."
Mm.
And so, that all of that's there. I mean, you could do stuff with that at the game level pretty easily. I'm astonished. Has no one written to Le Guin and asked for the license or written to the publisher? I mean, it's some.
I'm pretty sure that Le Guin just wasn't interested in letting other people muck around with her stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
the few times she let that happen, she was generally very disappointed.
Right.
I think
And
he was
yeah.
rather unhappy about there was a TV series made, I think.
There was
which
an
she was-
anime made. There was actually two. There was a British
Okay.
one, all with white British actors,
Mhm.
and that didn't go over. And then
No.
there was also an anime. And what's
Okay.
kind of interesting, a movie that's based mostly on The Farthest Shore, the third book. And what's kind of interesting about that is that although the imagery is not anything like her imagery, they actually get the story pretty right. I mean, philosophically, it ends up being a pretty thought-provoking kind of, depressing look at the importance
Yeah.
of death.
Yeah,
You
the
know, so
anime, I think
it was reasonably.
what I recall reading is that she didn't hate it. She just didn't really think it was her story.
Right, right. So, anyway, I guess, but her aside, I mean,
Yeah.
just looking at
Mm.
this as a licensing thing, I am minded of my experiences in the 80s dealing with comics professionals who were extraordinarily disturbed or frightened by gaming, by role players. And they were the kind of people who I've written about them before. It's when somebody would come up and say, can the rabbits in Usagi Yojimbo jump? And it's like, well, yeah, I made him a rabbit, and he jumped because that's kind of a joke on him being a rabbit. But it's not like there's a race of rabbits. And the gamer's like, what do you mean there's not a race of rabbits? Look, there's a rabbit. How did the rabbit people come about? And I'm just imagining, Stan Sakai going, who am I talking to?
Yeah.
Mm.
And so
Yeah.
the person I do know, I'm speculating about Sakai, but a related artist very close to Sakai who fits this perfectly, because I have heard her say this, was Kate Worley with Omaha the Cat Dancer. And she specifically even said in one of the letters column, I'm not a gamer. I don't get it. Why are they how come you want to know, like, how good does she have like a dancing score? Does she have a fucking score?
Mm.
I mean, what? I don't get it. And so I'm trying to kind of get away from that. I mean, my point of view is different. I think this medium does have all the power of any medium. But right here is a beautiful case of how we haven't done it.
Yeah.
And even if we don't, I'm not necessarily talking about simulating, doing Earthsea, but I'm talking about the ability to do something of that quality and caliber in terms of its plot, right? I mean, its plot is based on its meanings. They're not just floating symbolism in what's otherwise, an ordinary plot. And that's where I'm grappling. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on that, or are you as puzzled as me?
Yeah. So I mean, I go back to where we were before, which is to get an Earthsea that is focused on Sparrowhawk, and that kind of internal struggle can happen in the medium, but we don't really have the tools that directly work towards that. We have more tools that would work towards doing a story in Great Havmore.
Right.
And both are valid, but I don't know. it's hard to think about what's going to work for
except
for doing it.
maybe pulling back a little and going to something more akin to Primetime Adventures or
Possibly, although Primetime Adventures does very,
yeah,
very well in terms of like,
yeah,
well, soap opera, which is
yeah,
fine
Yeah.
because you could have that in the Great Havnor story and have like emotions and dramatic stuff and prices paid for power and all that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. But
And
I was more
yeah,
thinking of
yeah,
getting away from trying to simulate, if you want to call it that way, the world,
the magic
etc.
itself, right? Yeah,
Magic
you can get
itself,
away
and
with
going
you can
to
get with more of a sort of effects based thing, but
yeah,
Fudge does that.
yeah,
So I mean, you can stay
yeah.
nice
Fetch
and
does that.
yeah,
Fate maybe
right.
has
Well,
the aspects and the stuff
right.
which are
Fade,
more a
right.
bit more driven, suitable to driving the story.
True. Although I
But
will be
you,
perhaps a
yeah,
dissenter in terms of Fate because I think of it as an overly flat game. Um,
mm,
and so that's a topic for another day, I'm sure. But
yeah,
the
we
yeah,
can.
yeah. But the idea is that we do have games. I mean, here let's talk
Yeah.
about this for a second. Let's
Hmm.
take away all my negativism. Here I am being a pain in the ass. I'm sorry, Herman. Let's go ahead and work with it positively. We've got Primetime Adventures, we've got Fate and Fudge, which are the
Yeah,
one grew
similar,
from the
but
other.
it's a
Um,
family of things.
it's definitely a family. And
Yeah.
then we have a number of things which are thought I can think of more as the family of Primetime Adventures, which
Hmm.
is very much based on you've got a trait, roll some dice, now let's see how that trait does the thing. And actually Primetime Adventures gets that from the pool pretty directly, in fact.
Yeah.
So we've got that kind of approach. Well, one of the nice things about the pool and Primetime Adventures is that meta mechanic. In the pool, it's
Hmm.
the pool, and in Primetime Adventures, it's fan mail. But the idea being that there is this quality floating around, which is only there if and when we care.
Yeah.
And so, for those qualities that we were talking about last week, that's when you actually have a mechanic that ties into that final level of commitment. And it's one of the reasons why it's so compelling is that people actually see a way to make their commitment of that kind feed back into the
Yeah.
diagram.
Yeah, and
um
there's also a family there, of course. If you go look at things like The Shadow of Yesterday and
Absolutely, yeah.
what's the one with the sort of well, things in that vein.
I completely agree, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're looking at that. We've got some things along those lines, and sometimes there's values based stuff in there, like the keys in Shadow
Yeah.
of Yesterday as well.
Yeah, there's
So
what's it
I went
called?
ahead and
Mhm.
oh wait.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Gord.
I went ahead and checked on Google. There's actually a thread on RPG.net about doing an Earthsea
Mm-hmm.
RPG. Some people mentioned Prince's Kingdom.
Hmm.
The variant on
Yeah.
Yeah,
Dogs in the Vineyard, because it's very
Prince. Okay.
archipelago set.
Hmm.
And then there's a game which I have heard of, but I haven't looked at, called Archipelago, that directly says it's inspired by Le Guin's storytelling techniques, and it's everybody plays one character.
Right, right. I've actually always really liked that technique, and I'm sorry that my various attempts at doing it have never quite come to pass.
Mm-hmm.
Never
Yeah, I
been very
gotta
successful.
admit that's one of the things that is most stuck in my conception of RPGs is a player, a character or two, and a GM. That's where I'm most stuck as far
Right,
as the overall.
right. What you're
Mm-hmm.
willing to go for. Yeah,
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 exactly. And it's not even like I'm not willing to do different. It's just I haven't succeeded.
yeah. You keep not doing it. Yeah,
I
yeah.
keep
Yeah.
not doing it.
Right,
Exactly. I keep, oh
right.
yeah, we should try that. I can't find somebody else to do, or I decided, oh,
Or
you know
or
what?
something else
I'm not
bumps
interested in
ahead.
that
Yeah,
genre.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
interested in,
yeah.
yeah, I never get to there.
Well,
So,
so we do have a couple of things to look up and check out. That's for
Mm-hmm.
sure. And for all we know, one of them is got everything we need to talk about in this regard. But the curious question is, just as you say, what would we do in something like Primetime Adventures or the pool in which this happens? Would we just have to say in the beginning, guess what, guys? We're going to have our issues are not going to be like in Primetime Adventures. Our issues are not going to be, you know, the usual things you find in a Primetime Adventures games. Our issues
No,
are going
you
to be
really
like
have to.
what is truth?
Yeah.
You know, that seems that's kind of rich to like jump into in a lot of ways.
Mm.
Um, One almost wants to transform it, to say, okay, well, now that we've gotten a certain distance, now what are we doing? Perhaps sort of a quantum jump or shift in some way of what we're playing for, or what the topic is about, you know, because it's kind of, I mean, if one person at the table is all about the Jungian issue of the shadow as the self and all the rest of it, and nobody
Yeah.
else is,
It's not. It's
it's
not
going
going
to
to
be,
work, I think.
it's going to be a real pain at the ass of the table is
Yeah.
what it's going to be. Um, so anyway, it leaves us mainly with questions at this
Yeah.
point.
Um,
Well, right now I'm tasked with this cosmic zap thing for their HeroQuest
mm-hmm.
license, or SRD. And that's one of the interesting things about Cosmic Zap, is that it seizes upon such things with irresponsible abandon. Right? It's quite important that Thanos is in love with death, right? And death doesn't care.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of important. I mean, when the the panel sequence that I had in the blog where Adam Warlock, screams "Why!" and like smashes a stalagmite, and it catapults over and smashes another stalagmite, because that's what we like to
Mm-hmm.
draw. And the Y is like in big '60s letters, it's big honking letters. And then it's exactly the same as Ian Gillan's Deep Purple scream when he was playing Jesus on the album, and screams, "Why should I die?" And it's the same scream. I mean, Adam Warlock is
Yeah.
based on Jesus Christ Superstar. There's no doubt about that. And so the the fact that both of those can be genuinely chilling, even though you're a kid reading a comic or somebody getting stoned listening to a rock album, the fact that you can
Mm.
actually for a minute think, yeah, why, is reasonably powerful, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
reasonably, we're reading The Wizard of Earthsea and we're going, wow, yeah, he opened the gate and a demon crept through, and now this demon is like, terrible, and got to get the
Yeah.
demon back through the gate. And then you're thinking, no, he needs to step into his shadow.
Mm-hmm.
He will actually bring it into reality fully, because what he did when he opened that gate was not let it through, he pulled it away.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Wow. And so the more he tries to be a good guy who doesn't like do bad things, you got to recognize that you can do bad things. That's part of you. And so all that kind of stuff. And you're reading this and going, okay, well, as far as coming of age fantasy, that's actually kind of better than any other one I've ever read.
Mm-hmm.
When does role playing produce that quality? We know that writers can do it. We know that I doubt it's done on call. I doubt you sit down and write that
Mm.
because you say that's your skill set, that you do that. I don't really think that happens. I
It
think
does.
that you need a skill set to do it, but then there are times when you write that well and times when you don't. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, and in role playing, all we want is to give the best chance we can to doing
Right.
it well.
Exactly. So there's, I mean, like I say, I mean, if you have a system that guarantees that this kind of story gets made, then you just killed it, right? You killed it. You can't. Just means that you wrote the story. Thank you very much for us. So we are very interested in, all three of us, in how this is done, and
Hmm.
but it's phenomenology, right? It's not like how do we nail it down so that we can guarantee that it happens. We're talking
Yeah.
about we just want to know how this happens. God knows I tried for it in my Champions games of the 80s. All the time travel fuck ups and circles that I drew, all the the kind of awe-inspiring this and that I tried to, get everybody to be awe-inspired.
Hmm.
And again, I was not looking for them to be, I was not trying to inspire awe in me. I wanted all of us to become awe inspiring. That's what I wanted. And, some of the players are just baffled. It's like, Ron, when you go on like that, what the fuck are you talking about? And then others, kind of bought into it for fun. I mean, and then there were times when things went pretty, pretty hard, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
I pretty hard. And I'm looking at the current Hero Quest system and saying, is that going to be our road? Because that's the game in which I had the closest experience of that kind for all four of the people playing, unequivocally. All four of the people playing had what you might think of as a transformative experience playing Hero Wars, as it was named at the time. And it was not by accident. We embraced this mode of interaction and thought
Hmm.
in the form of dramatic action. We embraced it for months in play.
Yeah, and so figuring out what was the tie to that and the whatever administrative details about the system that you used. It's also been a long time since I've looked at Hero Wars / Quest, but having the right set of keywords, or figuring
Right.
out what the connections. Maybe if it was in, I mean, if you're trying to do it in Apocalypse World, you want to have the right moves. If you were doing it in,
Yeah, but
um,
is that really where it's at, or is that one of those things in the diagram that could be practically anything, and that there are other working parts of the diagram
yeah,
that,
you figure out which the one is that you
right,
want to. You
right.
just got to
Yeah.
find somewhere to slot that in,
Hmm.
and in reality, it could just get slotted in by your practice,
Right,
by
but we're
what
talking
ends
about
up
when
happening.
it's not. We're talking about when
But
it's
what
not.
we're talking
Right,
about is trying to give a better chance of that happening, and
right.
so then
Hmm.
finding the right place.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
as you pointed out earlier, doing it in a way that doesn't say, "Oh, well, okay, you've got these three choices, the other player's got these three choices, and obviously what's going to happen is it's going to go one
Right.
way, and we're done."
Everybody picks a choice, and then we go to the place on the table where it says what happens, and that's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you were role playing in Earthsea, what would it be really cool to actually be able to do as, in game?
yeah. I think mostly exploring what does it mean to be that mage, to have that connection to the world, and to make that choice not to use all the powers you've given to do certain things. But if you ask me what system would I use to do it with, I
Hmm.
think that's more story and background and more the soft and the immaterial stuff than hard rules,
That's
as
what
I look at it.
I'm thinking about that. Um, as the system does matter guy, you know,
Hmm.
that is a complex question. But I am thinking about back in our game, which we were using Glorantha, it was my passion about what I considered to be genuine content for Glorantha that powered everybody else grabbing the pieces of that and bringing to it what they thought and felt. Um, but the system did matter in terms of being able to express it in a way that wasn't just, oh, we say it in the fiction now. And that's one
Yeah.
of the things why I'm a little skeptical about the fate or pool approach, is that just being able to roll and basically just have the right to say something
Mm-hmm.
isn't really, I think, enough. Um, so I'll have to think more about that. Somewhat more pertinent, perhaps, is the short story by Le Guin, which is not part of the novels, but is usually thought of as part of the Earthsea Eve, which is the story about the mage who gets trapped by a rival. Have you ever read this?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he gets
That
trapped
sounds.
in a magical trap by a rival,
Mm-hmm.
and he has to turn into a bat to escape. And it's a very internal story. I don't even remember if the physicality of the trap is ever described. It might be, but I can't remember it. It's described experientially and magically in very compelling terms. It is the classic anecdote that gets repeated in so many other books, including in the Earthsea trilogy. One day you change into the animal form one too many times and you don't come back,
Mm-hmm.
or you stay too long and you don't come back. And this, in somewhat, have you ever read To Build a Fire by Jack London? And just
I don't.
how agonizing it is that the guy keeps almost
Not
succeeding in making the fire, and it gets more and more numb and more,
Mm.
disadvantaged in doing so, and his initial attempt where he really, got a fire going and it seemed like things were going to be okay. And then, and it goes through like so many of these until he finally freezes to death. And by the end, you're like sitting there shivering because you've actually gone through this. This story's the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The almost gets out and is able to stop being a bat, steps, and the increasing desperation. And he does get out, but he can't turn back. And he's forgotten. It's not like, oh, I'm trapped in the body of a bat. No, it's gone. He's a bat. And so that it's a pretty chilling story in a lot of ways. Um, but that, to some extent, do you mean it? Do you mean it? Do you mean it?
Mm-hmm.
Successive questions of that level may well be involved. And to go to comics and the Cosmic Zap again, that ties into Englehart's work with Frank Brunner and Gene Colan on Doctor Strange, where the Cthulhu villain monster, basically destroys Doctor Strange's life, one thing after the other, 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 that he has to give up on in order to keep combating this
Mm-hmm.
being. And the famous climax, of course, is that the conduit of the being is the self of the Ancient One. The Ancient One has exited himself from the cosmos so that he won't be such a bother by letting this thing in, and is in this utter meditative state of transcendence in order to basically, not exist, not be there, to not be. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the best he can do, is just like be in this state. And it's not working. The thing's coming through. And usually the question in the literature of this kind is, the guy's going to suffer. He's going to suffer. Oh no, I've got to kill my master or let this thing through. What can I do? What can I do? Strange doesn't fucking hesitate. He's like, and kills the Ancient One. I think he suffers for a page or so. But
yeah.
you know, but the point being that, yeah, Strange says, yeah, too far is
Mm-hmm.
far enough. Only too far is far enough. And at the end, he is the Sorcerer Supreme. That's how you do it. And so, yeah, that's where I think I'm going to have to focus on, because look, and that's really where we get with all of these stories, isn't it? Thematically.
Yeah, there's a very, very clear connection uh, between character and cosmos that you
Right.
see
Mm-hmm.
in what you've just described, and I think in Earthsea. and it's interesting, in Earthsea, in some ways, it's very understated, whereas my impression of the Zap is that
it's
overstated.
it's operatic. There's no question.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
when the Magus, when
same
Warlock's future self appears, and he's like basically in this disco costume with a huge silver afro, you're like, of course he is. Of course he's got backup singers.
What else would
he have? The trouble is, you get there through effective narrative and imagination, and depiction.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get there through explanation. You can't tell somebody you're going to do this. You got to lure them in. You got to say, this is a story about an arrogant youngster at the wizard school. What's going to happen to him? You got to tell a story about, this is just a coming of age story. You've got to say, this is a Marvel comic. We got people in skin tights hitting each other. You've got to kind of got to get them on the cheese whiz first. And but it's got to be good. It's got to be made with real cheese. Even if Wizard of Earthsea had never gone where it went, it would still be a quite nicely readable, if unremarkable, it would have been a well-written, readable story of a young wizard, no problem. I mean, we could have just had him like stay at that level that we're talking about, and yes, he becomes the wizard, but now he has to go and meet Jasper again. And now we have the adult version of their conflict. Maybe it's flipped around. Maybe Jasper's changed. He's changed. And it could be very dramatic. And there could be supporting characters, and the fate of Havnor could be in balance.
Yeah, but it would be a very different story then.
Right, but it would be perfectly viable, and it would be considered, it would be, and you know what? There'd be a role-playing game of it.
Oh, yeah.
But the issue that I think is highlighted with role-playing is, since everybody involved, at least the way that we're talking about trying to play, is to some degree an author, you can't fool them unless they fool themselves.
Well, here's what I'm talking about. Otherwise, it's not going to be fooling so much as just engaging. Because I'm thinking of my Hero Wars game.
Yeah.
I think the idea was that I didn't have to convince them that this was going to be profound. They just had to like it as fantasy and be impressed by various details until they started to own the details and commit.
Well, yeah, and start to run with, at some point, and start to run with them and incorporate them into their own understanding.
Completely.
That's the thing that I was thinking is a little tricky about it, is that, because I am 100% confident that the first time I went through the Earthsea books, most of this stuff was not there for me. It was rereadings or rethinkings that brought a lot of this stuff up. And so if a role-playing game were modeled on my first reading, it would be a failure in these terms, because I just kind of showed up and read them and got a little something out of it, but it didn't really punch me.
Right, but that's literature.
Yeah.
Role-playing is slower and has reflective space in it.
Yeah, that's true. Kind of by definition, it would. Yeah, it kind of incorporates coming back to the material in ways.
Right, exactly. And when the material has that kind of power, I'm thinking of a couple other examples besides that one game, I think that the reflective quality of it is very involved. Guys, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll see you later.
Great.
Excellent.
Great.
All right, guys. Good night, everybody.
Bye.